This is Terry Clarke and Phil Clarke, brothers. They were from Kidderminster, and they are the co-founders of Klark Teknik, which obviously is still in business to this day. Those with a local knowledge will know Kidderminster is probably famous for only one thing, and that's carpets. I'm sure we're all in agreement. I worked in the carpet industry myself. So it's interesting, the story starts in an industry that's largely carpet-based, because the industry they actually helped spearhead was pro audio. But the story is actually a transcontinental one, because it starts partly with Kidderminster and partly with Australia. Terry Clarke was a guitarist, enjoyed playing music. He played for Clifford T. Ward and he helped record on his first album. And interestingly, his brother Phil was the manager of Clifford T. Ward and the Cruisers in the early days. Phil had decided to emigrate to Australia with his wife Jenny, who sadly passed away some years later. Jenny was running a successful amount of boutiques. She got about 6 stores over there from Sydney and outwards, whereas Phil decided to start a nightclub and was hugely successful with this nightclub. So obviously he tells his brother, Terry, we're doing really well over here, come and play in my club band. So basically Terry comes over about 18 months later and starts performing in his band. But he was only actually playing about 2 gigs a week, doing a bit of touring now and again. Terry had got no real background in electronics, but he had a keen interest in it. And what would happen quite often was he'd end up having to repair a lot of the stuff. Just seemed to have a very good aptitude towards doing it. While he had a lot of downtime, he met this gentleman called Bruce Brown in Sydney. Bruce was a studio designer. He designed very early studio equipment and studios. And one of his most famous studios is Albert Studios, which is the studio that AC/DC recorded all of their early recordings before they recorded with Mutt Lange. In his downtime, Terry would help Bruce, and he learned his trade basically as a result, immediately with directly working with him. And obviously that studio is world famous now. Lots of other people have recorded there, like In Excess, for example. After a short time, they returned back to England. I think Terry came back first and then Phil shortly after. And Terry got a job at Decca Records in Bridgnorth that had a pressing plant, no longer with us anymore. And he was responsible for helping to build and maintain these massive winding machines for the cassette duplication plant. And he met a gentleman there called Doug Smith. Doug would end up years later becoming the production manager of Klark Teknik. Meanwhile, Phil Clarke, who in this story comes across as a bit of a Dell boy, had got his hand into an idea he'd brought back from Australia, which is the fact that because there was a water shortage, the government made everybody in Australia wash their car at a proper car wash. And these systems would recycle the water ready for the next customer to use. Washing your car in the street was banned, basically. Because there was similar legislation in the UK, he brought this idea back and said to Terry, look, could we rip this idea off? Can we do this kind of version over here? So Terry made some coin-operated, they weren't pressure washers, they were just normal hoses, basically. And the forecourt equipment bloomed from that, and they introduced vacuums and other things like that. So a bit of an unusual or unlikely start to this story. This very awful, like ex-army tin hut you may recognise from Summerfield site, which is just outside of, on the way out of Kidderminster on the way to Worcester. I always think these look like the Thunderbird 2 pods that he's gonna sit on. Well, when I was a kid I thought that anyway. The Nissan hut that they actually worked from is no longer there, but this is a very good representation because this is actually taken from that site, and it was the Ministry of Supply. But actually years later it turned out it was the Ministry of Defence, and they were actually sat on a load of rocket fuel underneath in bunkers. So if that had gone up, I wouldn't be stood here having this conversation with you. So. And there's the old address, as you can see. So basically they started doing the forecourt equipment from out of here, but Terry was keen to get into pro audio. He'd started having a go at making small graphic equalisers. And the first of all being this one, which is the Technic 7S, which is a little 7-band EQ. It's about this big. And a gentleman here called Vic Kerry, who recorded and produced the song Young, Gifted and Black. If you look here, you can actually see these little units have been fit into his EMI console. So he'd left these cavities for Terry to design and build these EQs. Being a very small industry, back then you couldn't just buy musical equipment like this. It all had to be built by hand. There was no Thomann or Amazon, at this point in time. So being a small industry, word got round and people were like, oh, I'd like an EQ, but I want it larger, I want more frequency range. So a 9S and an 11S version were later created, all of these being hand-built. One of the other interesting factors was they had a go at making tape recorders or tape machines, and actually beat competition from people who were big forerunners in this, like Studer and Levers Rich. And actually, when this order went out to tender, they chose Klark Teknik's tape machine because it was better quality. But they found that after a while, the tape machine industry was becoming a bit of a distraction away from graphic equalisers and signal processing. So what they actually did eventually was abandon this and gave it to one of the competitors, Levers Rich, who missed out on a massive BBC contract. Terry went to London and helped them build the first production models, and they basically bought the rights to this off them, which would have generated quite a lot of income. And that was the end of the tape machine. That's actually a real manual. You can see it looks like somebody's hand drawn it. Perhaps he got his daughter to do it or something when she was about 7. The interesting thing about the name and the logo is this logo is actually based on a tape spool, and it's because of the tape player connection that logo still exists to this day. But a lot of people ask, why is it Klark Teknik? Well, it was Clarke, that was their surname, but they chose this bizarre spelling. Now, as a young boy, when I used to drive past this factory, I used to think it was Swedish or Scandinavian or German, and they did that on purpose because British quality back then in the 70s had an appalling reputation, as you can see, you're all laughing in recognition, with companies on strike every 5 minutes. So they purposely chose this name because, as my young mind thought, Germanic or Scandinavian in its sounding, and it sort of levered them away from, the dogma of British build, or the stigma rather. Let me just see if I can go back a second. Yeah, that's fine. One of the first larger graphic equalisers they did was the 27S. This was another hand-built one. Obviously, all the components would have had to have been hand-wired. The panels used to be milled and engineered by hand as well. And this particular model I found was sold at an auction about £500, £600. This one would have been bought at about 76, and it probably featured on a lot of Queen's records because they recorded at Mountain Studio at Montreux in Switzerland. And you can see under here some of the people that would have recorded in that period, so quite possibly it was used on those recordings. The first batches were handmade, but they couldn't keep doing that forever. So they decided to sell the garage equipment. Well, it became Kidderminster Garage Equipment Limited, was sold off to its then manager. And basically, Phil and Terry solely now concentrated on Klark Teknik. Klark Teknik was founded, and the first product they made was basically a production model of the 27S, which is called the DN27. And basically, from this little green shack, the industry exploded because their company eventually became like the Rolls-Royce of EQs, and it's still revered to this day. As a result of that success, they could then venture into all different sorts of things: signal processing, speaker management, digital delays. So they basically went off in several different avenues. But all of this would have been produced in Summerfield. This is another one of their models, and this sold to the BBC in large numbers as well. But 6,500 of the DN27s, the previous one you've just seen, had been built. The DN15 here would have been sold to the BBC. So it was inevitable that you can't live out of a green shack forever if you're going to expand your business. So they actually occupied this land here, which is right next to Birch and Coppice. Obviously, it's an aerial photograph. And you can see the construction of the units, 5, 6, 7 and 8 at the back, and the offices at the front. What was interesting was the foresight to think, well, we'll build our office here and we'll occupy perhaps Unit 1, and then we'll rent all the other units out to other people as an income. But as the company expanded, they could then basically evict, if you like, those businesses. Because we used to have here, for example, in Unit 2, a meat produce plant. So every morning you'd smell sausage rolls coming over the gap in the roof, which wasn't particularly pleasant, but there you go. So they basically expanded as the business grew. They physically expanded into these units. So much so that they actually had to build a third floor, as you can see here.